In this class module, we're going to go over warping and how you can use it for sound design. Now, the scope of this class is we're going to look deeper into warp modes and using warp modes to morph a sound. Also, we're going to look at vocal correction with warp modes and stretching, as well as creative percussion and a very important technique called resampling. So to start, let's look at Ableton Live and the power of warp modes. I have these different samples. These basic samples, if I play this scene, it's going to play all those different samples. And the thing that you're going to just listen to how they sound. They're not warped right now in any crazy fashion. They're just warped to fit the same timing. Now I'm going to play some different versions of those same samples, but they've been warped creatively through either beats mode, we've got complex mode, or all these different types of warp modes to create a new sound. Now you notice that is much more percussive and it has more of a minimal sound to it. It's a really cool way of taking any sound and changing it into micro little percussion. Now, in that one, I did similar things of making micro percussion, but also stretching them to create weird little new rhythms, as well as messing with the guitar riff to make it much lower. And also, we can use this for interesting changes of the vocals. Now, here's just the normal vocal. And here's one change to more of a male vocal. And you can use that together to create really interesting harmonies from that same original vocal sample. And that's another basic way of using transposition as well as warp modes to create cool, unique, new sound design. So now let's look into Live and how we can start using these types of techniques. Now, the first thing we're going to have to talk about is what are warp modes. Every time you stretch audio, you have to add information to fill in the gaps. Or if you speed it up, you have to also somehow warp the sound to fit the new timing. This is where warp modes come in. So I have this original sample, right? It plays for these 2 bars. Now, if I made it twice the size, a lot longer, so I've slowed it down, I'm going to have all this time in between to fill. And here's what that would look like if the sample's slowed down. See how I have twice the amount of information, and something needs to happen in there, otherwise it would sound choppy where it plays and stops. And that's where our different warp modes come in. There are different warp modes for different types of audio. The different setting lets you fill in the space in different ways to best keep the aspects of the audio that you want. And within Live, we have beats, tones, textures, repitch, complex, and complex pro. I'm going to review real quick the different types of modes, and then we're going to look at how we can creatively use them. So beat mode works great for things that are mainly rhythmic, things like drum loops and maybe electronic dance music that's very staccato or has lots of very obvious rhythms. Tones mode helps preserve the tonal or pitch of the original sample. This is best used for melody or harmony-rich samples. Then we have texture mode. Texture mode mainly keeps the spatial quality of the sample, best for field recordings and strange pads, things like rain, wind, things like that. Then we have repitch mode, and repitch mode speeds or slows the playback by pitching the original sample. This is similar to vinyl. Now, the amazing thing about repitch mode is it doesn't change the original sample very much. By slowing it down, you naturally lowering down the pitch, but you're not changing the sample in any way. It's non-destructive, where a lot of these other ones are somehow stretching or morphing the sample. Then lastly, we have complex and complex pro mode. Complex mode is warping method specifically designed to accommodate composition signals that combine the characteristics covered by other warp modes. It works well for warping entire songs. So in other words, if you have an entire track, it's going to use all these different mathematical concepts and algorithms to look at beats and tones and textures and things like that and warp it appropriately, automatically, to make the whole song slower or faster. Complex Pro is an updated version that is more CPU intensive, but it's also a lot better for vocals or transposing. And we're going to look at the creative use of Complex Pro because I find that one to be really interesting. So those are the basic modes. Now that we've reviewed the different warp modes, in the rest of the videos, we're going to look at how we can creatively use these modes in our own music production. Now we're going to look at the creative warp modes beats live set. Now in this live set, when you open it up, you're going to be able to follow along with the activities that I show here. This set is found within the live pack creative warp modes, and it comes with this course. You can look at the download link below, or if you've downloaded it on any other pages, you can just open up that live pack and in there look at the creative warp modes beats live set. And right here on the side, I have a little explanation of what to do and to what to try out with these samples to fully get an idea of using these beats mode. So first, let's play this. Now let's really lower the BPM. We can hear it's kind of chopping it up, right? Well, if we come over here, we are set to beats in our warp mode, and it's set to transients. So transient means it's looking at whatever these little gray triangles at the top are, and those are representing hits. In other words, those are like the hitting of a drum or the striking of a string. Something that's an obvious increase of volume is a transient. And then this setting here under the preserved is what happens after it plays that transient. So right now we had it set to play and then stop. So since this is so much slower, it's playing it probably to about here, stopping, silence, next transient, so on. But we can change it to something like this, which is forward, forward. So it gives it kind of a stutter sound, or forward back. And if we turn this way down, you can hear it doing that. It plays and then it repeats a section of it. Now, if this was pretty close to the original, you're not going to hear it that well. But the cool thing is when you come into here and you pick something like this forward and straight, and then change the envelope is kind of acting like a decay amount. So it's saying right now it's only playing 11% of the total transient, where this is 100%. And you can see how you get really interesting percussive sounds. And that's what I was showing in the opening exercise. Now let's look how we could use this on something like a pad. Now here we are with a riser. So it's just a really weird riser sound, right? Well, let's turn it into beats mode, and we still have that transient set to transient, and then set to forward stop, and we can change this envelope. But what I want to do is I want to create like an interesting rhythm that speeds up. And this is all going to make a sense in just 1 second. So now we do that. And I'm going to even zoom in here. So I'm making these little warp modes by just double clicking. And as you can see, it's kind of looking like it's getting faster and faster because I'm creating more little warp points. Now every warp point is considered a transient. So if you remember before, it plays only those transient sounds. And now we'll get this kind of interesting stutter. Let's play it. And then we can play with something like the transient amount. So we can even change this as it's playing. And you can see how you get some really cool, interesting sounds out of that. Great. So next, let's look at how we can do interesting things with grooves. Now I have this beat here. Let's turn it down the speed. Now let's say I want to take this type of groove and apply it to something like that riser or anything to create an interesting change in the beats mode. So what I can do is if I right click, I can say extract grooves, and it's going to read this file. It's going to read all those little transients, those little hits, right? All the little triangles. It reads that, and it says, okay, that's where those are. We're going to make a new file with that information, and then you can add it to anything else. So if I just drag this over, let me insert a MIDI. What it really did is it made a little MIDI information of where all those hits were. But if I take it and throw it on top of any other sample, it's applying this groove to this sample. And right here is what groove is being applied. And then there's this little commit button. If you hit commit, it's going to change the timing to fit what that groove was. So let's hit that. Notice how it kind of made warp modes and it might have moved them, but what I need to do is move this, increase this quantize setting. So the quantize is going to quantize all these little hits into wherever the hits were on this one. So now if I hit commit, we have all those little hits, and it snapped all of them to what we were seeing here. So if I play this, you can see it's in that groove. Now if I turn this to complex just so we don't hear that, it's just a pad. But by putting it in beats mode and having extracted this beat, this groove, and putting it on there, we have a nice, interesting little stab sound that's on the beat. So that's how we can creatively use beats mode. Now let's look at different ways that we can use warp modes to morph our textures and tones. So tones and textures can add a powerful arsenal to your sound design. To do this, we must use a resample track. Now, a resample track in Live is a very powerful tool. Live's master output can be routed into an individual audio track and recorded or resampled. Resampling can be a fun and useful tool as it lets you create samples from what is currently happening in a live set that can be then immediately integrated in the rest of the set. Very simple example is come over to my IO ins and out setting here. I can say my audio from, and if I put it to resample, if I have it set to record and I play this, what it's doing is it's recording everything that the master's hearing, which right now is these 2 tracks. So I'm going to set this to auto so we can now hear it. And if I play it, that was basically a recording of everything that was happening within Live. It's a very powerful tool for what we're going to do next. You can download this pack and then be able to play with these examples and also follow the instructions. This is perfect to use either for students can check it out, or if you're just wanting to learn these different techniques, you can download the pack and then play along with these ideas to get your hands on. Now in this one, we're going to be in arrangement view. Because of that, I have the information here. You can always open the info text by going to View, Help View, and then that'll have that information there. Right, so to start, we're just going to have a very basic crash sound. Nothing special there, right? And after we're playing with the warp modes, we're going to come up with some really cool new rising sounds. Now, a classic riser is just taking this, putting it in reverse. It's cool, but it could still use a little work. So one thing we could do is, let's say with warp modes, we can stretch this audio. So I'm making it like much longer than before. Great. Now the longer we make it, the more interesting it'll become with playing with the warp modes. I'm even going to just start it here for speed of things. Now notice we're getting a stuttering kind of sound. That's because of the warp modes is in tones. And it's cutting it up by this grain size. So grain size is basically saying the amount of increments that are being repeated to fill in that empty space as soon as we stretched it. So if I lower this, notice how it was getting tighter and tighter. It was getting less warbly. Well, the kind of cool effect that we can do is if we insert an audio track, put it into resample. I'm going to hit record on there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to record myself moving the grain size. So now we're getting kind of a wobbling sound. And you can even see it, right? You can kind of see that movement happening within the sample, much more than the original. Great, now that we have that, we can start playing with things like transposition on top of it. So I'm just going to keep this one over here. And I can just, this is the awesome thing about resample, I can just keep resampling. So now I'm going to use my transpose knob. I'm going to grab it here. And then if I hit my envelopes, I can then make, oh, that's not what I want. I want clip and then transition, and then I can come in here and transpose it. I'm holding Alt just to make a little curve. Great, now we're starting to get a sound that I want. So let's record that. I'm just going to keep all these examples. Awesome, I like that sound. Now, I've transposed it down. What would happen if I start transposing it up? because it already is transposing down. But if I transpose it up and then do something cool with the warp modes, I'll get more and more movement out of it. So to start, let's put it into texture mode, and I'm even going to double it. I'm also going to have to double the... Now I'm going to do the same thing where I'm going to record myself moving this grain size. So it's small. Notice how we got kind of that, the bigger the grain size, the bigger that warbling type sound that went as it opened. So great, now we have this sound. And then what can be really cool is if we insert another audio track and we take maybe one of your other ones that went down, and you can start to layer these things. And we're going to even duplicate it, reverse it. And there's this thing called fades. So Control-Alt-F on PC. I think it's Command-Alt-F on Mac. And that just gives us a little tail end. I'm going to turn that volume down a little bit there. And even turn down that tail end. I'm going to turn that down quite a bit. I just wanted a little splash. Great, so I can now record all of that. And we're getting all sorts of interesting textures. We're getting rising sounds, falling sounds, different types of rhythmic warbling due to the warp modes and so on. And this gave us, now let's compare to the original. That's not even the original. Let us... All right, so here's the original, just reversed. And here's what we got. And the cool thing about this is you can keep playing with it more and more and more. You can put it into textures mode or tones mode and come in here and then again resample it. And change that transposition. And it can just get more and more complicated by recording yourself moving these grain knobs and more. It's just a really awesome way of creating cool risers, cool sound effects and sound designs just by using warp modes. So the point is, when you learn things like how to use warp modes, how to stretch your sound, it actually opens up tons of possibilities for new types of sounds and sound designs. It's kind of like stretching a rubber band, but to fill in that time, we can either repeat itself, create that warble sound, or we can create silence like we were doing with the texture, all these different possibilities. Now we're going to look at creative use of warp modes within vocals. Now I have this recording from Holly Thornton, and we're just going to play that, and then we're going to play with the different warp modes and what we can do with them later on.
I don't want to give you up. I don't want to hold you up. I don't want to pick you up. I just know that I had enough. I don't want...
Right? It's pretty good. It's a great start of something. And the two modes that I like to use when affecting the vocals are Complex and Complex Pro. Now in Complex, let's solo this.
I don't want to give you up. I don't want to hold you up. I don't want to pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
Now, if you can hear that, it's a little off. It's a little grainy sounding. That's because I did some corrective timing within this. Now, Complex Pro is a more advanced algorithm which takes care of a lot of those issues, especially with vocals. So if I put this in a Complex Pro and play it, you'll probably notice that it is a lot cleaner of a sound.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough. I don't wanna give you up.
As you can see, the Pro is a little bit cleaner. Now, when you're editing vocals, I suggest staying within Complex Pro. There are some other interesting changes within Complex or Complex Pro that can be used creatively. If I go with Complex and I pitch it, let's just say down 5.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
Now we start hearing this type of sound a lot in electronic music, trap, things like that. Now it becomes even more obvious if I bring it down to, let's say, 7.
I don't wanna give you up.
It's lower pitched, but it's pretty much just repitching it. It doesn't have the same natural qualities of a human voice. And that's where Complex Pro comes in and what these two settings are. So in Complex Pro, using the format and envelope, we're trying to basically grab the parts of the human voice that make it sound natural and then adjust it differently than the transpositioned part of the rest of the vocals to make it seem more realistic. Even let's just play it now.
I don't wanna give you up.
And notice that difference.
I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
Now we can move the format, which I like to think from male to female.
I don't wanna give you up.
I don't wanna hold you up.
I don't wanna pick you up.
And then when the envelope, the speed of which it's taking on.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up.
So I find about in the middle of the envelope is good, and depending on what you're trying to do with the vocal, you can move it low or high.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up.
For this one, I like it right in between. So this is a great start of doing something creative, right? Well, something else you can do is if I just duplicate it, I press Control D or Command D to duplicate that whole track. Let's put this one in normal, and then this one is pitched down. So now let's play that.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
Awesome. Now we're off to some cool start with all these different harmonies and things that we can do. But you can even get more interesting by coming in here and doing something like I'm pressing Control E or Command E to cut. And then let's transpose this by 5.
Give you up. I don't wanna hold you up.
And we can then create different.
I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up.
Like, let's take this whole section and transpose it down as well. So let's even go 12.
Wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
And we can, the interesting thing about clips is I can have different settings for different parts of the track as soon as I cut it, because when I cut it, it turns it into its own clip, right? So any parameter changed here is different from everything else. The great thing about that is I can then change the formats.
I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
And that way I can begin to get some really interesting change.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't wanna hold you up. I don't wanna pick you up. I just know that I had enough.
And that's how you can start creating interesting glitches and things like that we see in a lot more EDM and trap style music, dubstep, things like that. A lot of these newer genres that are coming out. And that's a very creative way of using warp mode, specifically Pro and Complex. I highly suggest chopping up this sample that I have within this live pack and playing with using different settings for different parts and making a new melody line out of this vocal. It's a very fun activity, and you'll be surprised the kind of effects you can get, especially once we start adding things like reverb.
I don't wanna give you up. I don't hold you up. I don't wanna break you up. I just know that I had enough.
So that's creative use of the warp modes on vocals. Now, remember we were looking at warp modes, we were talking about how it stretches the sound and how it fills in that information. And filling in that information with a slowed down sample is where we can actually start being creative. And that's where we've looked at the different modes, such as the beats mode, in which we can minimalize sound. We also looked at tones and texture mode as a cool way of creating these kind of warble or sound effects type of thing from something as simple as a crash. And then we looked at complex and complex pro in vocals and how we can edit vocals to make a very interesting and unique new sound, creating new harmonies within the vocals. It's also a great way to take a female vocal and turn it into a male or vice versa. There's lots of fun things to be had there. So now that you've looked at all this, I highly suggest you download the pack and try out these different exercises yourself. And for that, all you have to do is install the pack. For that, all you have to do is install the pack, and then when you do, you can open up the different examples. So if I open up Beats, you can then see all the different things to do with this sample. Here's the activity, and then here's another activity for this sample, and so on. And it's very easy to just open up any given set. So here's the crash one, and then here's your instructions right here on the side. Go through it, play around with it, and you'll learn a lot along the way.